Yeah, I'm just putting in my earplugs here.
Okay, good afternoon. My today's guest is Dr. Blair Stonechild. And Doctor, I'm really pleased to welcome you for these discussions. According to the format of our show, I introduce my guests at the beginning. So I will try to do that, and I will share my screen. I hope it will work. I'm not very good in technologies, but I will try my best. Dr. Blair Stonechild is a Cree Saulteaux member of the Musqueam First Nation and professor of Indigenous Studies at First Nations University of Canada. Dr. Stonechild is an internationally recognized researcher in the field of Indigenous studies and Indigenous post-secondary education. His book, The New Buffalo, The Struggle for Post-Secondary Education, is considered as one of the first and the leading text in the field. Blair is a survivor of the Capel Indian Residential School. He obtained his bachelor's degree from McGill University and master's and doctorate degrees from University of Regina. In 1976, Dr. Stonechild joined the First Nations University of Canada as its first faculty member and has been Dean of Academics and Executive Director of Development and many other administrative and academic positions. I could talk about Dr. Stonechild a lot, and because we work together, but I think it would be much more interesting to ask him to answer my questions. Just to finalize my introduction, I want to mention about some of his publications, the major publications, Loyalty, Death, Indians, and the Northwest Rebellion, the New Buffalo Aboriginal Post-Secondary Policy in Canada, Buffy St. Mary, It's My Way, The Knowledge Seeker Embracing Indigenous Spirituality. This is the award-winning book, by the way. And his most recent book, Loss of Indigenous Eden and the Fall of Spirituality. I would like to start with this book, actually. What is the Indigenous Eden?
Well, first of all, thank you for that generous introduction, Arzu. You're being too generous.
No, that's just a few portion of that I found, and I've heard from my colleagues. This is an informal discussions, but I could tell much more.
Okay. Well, the question you asked about Indigenous Eden, that term actually came from one of the first elders that I met when I started working at the Saskatchewan Indian Federated College. And he was commenting on the Bible. And he was commenting on the story of the Garden of Eden. And he was talking about how, as Indigenous people, for example, myself in residential school, we were taught that Adam and Eve were the first humans, right? And then as you hear this story being told, right away we hear that Adam and Eve were kind of disobedient, and they ate of this apple of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And because they did that, all of humanity basically was kicked out of the Garden of Eden. And, we have kind of been living under that state ever since. But this elder, whose name was Ernest Tutus, he had a different take on it. He was saying, he used to tell me, and I heard him say that to me quite a few times when I was first at the college. He says, we used to live in the Garden of Eden. And he says, we never abuse the gifts of the Creator. And, I never really thought of it that much back when, in those years. But as I started understanding more about Indigenous spirituality and what's happened to Indigenous people, I began to sort of get a different picture of what Eden, the Garden of Eden means, and what that elder was talking about. So, it's a long story because I'm sure you've probably grown up with the same story, haven't you, Arzu? Have you probably heard that, right?
Yeah, many nations actually have similar stories, and it's kind of like you made the connection to my next question. I was thinking, um, I grew up in a small town, and my father, he was a village boy, and I spent all my summers in that village, in small village. Um, then I lived in large cities, multi-million cities, and I did my PhD in Moscow. So it's another story. Um, in 2008, I started a research project about the water quality and I had very ambitious kind of like idea, a goal to develop mathematical model of water quality using the indigenous knowledge. And I decided to interview elders. To be honest, again, now it sounds very ambitious for me, and I now just surprised how I did that. I didn't know anything about this indigenous culture, indigenous beliefs, but I was very fortunate. I was very lucky that the two communities, Kakushta and Pipikis, they agreed to work with me. And first time I visited Kakushta First Nations community, I was told that I would interview 5 elders. I came to the band office. I came first, and I was sitting, I was waiting, and I was really nervous. I don't want to make secret. A lady entered the room, about 70 something years old, probably 78 years old. I don't know. I don't have the scientific explanation, but as she entered, my feeling was that exactly as my grandmother. That was my grandmother. And when I talked a little bit about the project, something I don't even remember what I told her. Then she started talking. Believe me, that was my grandmother just speaking English instead of Azeri. Almost the same logic, and kind of like very open, this welcoming type of like feeling. Then that was very good. I mean, all other elders, but the first one was so kind of welcoming that since that I feel very comfortable myself when I visit First Nations community. First, the environment is very similar to that I had in my childhood, and the people. Although sometimes I even I met elders, they didn't even speak English, and we had a translators, but still we had very good understanding. Then I I talked to one indigenous knowledge keeper from South Africa. It was about the water quality. We communicated by Skype. Again, the same feeling. But I'm very glad you mentioned that we had the same type of stories. But when I talk to kind of like average people, for them, indigenous means something local. But I used to think that way. But now I think it's not local. It's yeah, we speak different languages. Maybe we have different academic backgrounds, cultural backgrounds. But indigenous is something common. What do you think? Where that common things come from?
Well, I think it comes from our long heritage, human heritage. And, one of the things that I point out is that modern humans have been around for about 200,000 years, right? And, we don't think much of them really. We think of them as cavemen. We think of them as not having very much intelligence or anything like that. But, people who have studied modern humans say, they were just as capable as we were in terms of intelligence and the way that, our bodies operated and stuff. I mean, they're very much modern humans. Some people say you could have taken one of them and stuck them in a modern classroom and nobody would tell the difference, right? So, what was going on in their heads, right? Was there nothing going on in their heads? Well, I think basically if you want to understand ancient peoples, so-called primitive peoples, I mean, all you really need to do is look at indigenous people, because indigenous people were very much in harmony with their environment. They're very much tied to their land. And it was believed that they had a sacred relationship with the land. So if you're in if your people live in a certain area, you have a special sacred relationship with the plants in that area, with the stones, the animals, anything that exists in that area. Those are sort of considered to be like the gifts of the Creator, which have been given to these particular people to enjoy and to benefit and to learn from, and also to be responsible to as stewards. And so, when I think of the Garden of Eden, that's what I think of. I think of harmony, and sometimes you get people who kind of draw imaginary pictures of the Garden of Eden, right? They have people and animals are being, getting along really good and all that kind of stuff. I think that was true because, we did believe that we had a kinship relationship with all of these other created beings. It was, we called them our relatives. And, this was something that was an arrangement that basically came from the Creator. And, but I think probably the thing which most people miss when they talk about the Garden of Eden is there's one fundamental, most important relationship which everybody seems to kind of gloss over, and that's the continuing relationship with the Spirit, with the Creator, with the supernatural. And I think that was the thing which really distinguishes Indigenous people and Indigenous ideology from what we know as civilized modern culture. And my theory in the book I just released, which is called Loss of Indigenous Eden, is that for 194,000 years before the rise of civilization, that Indigenous people knew how to maintain that link with the spiritual part of themselves from their spiritual origins. And they did that through ceremonies, through spiritual disciplines, and through following what we call the good path, which was, how we perceived that the Creator originally wanted us to live in. And so, to me, that is what Indigenous Eden means to me. And when you come to something like the story of Adam and Eve, to me, that's the story of civilization.
So, globally speaking, and do you think we kind of past the point of no return, or we still have the chance for coming back to that Indigenous Eden?
Well, you're kind of jumping to the end of the story here. Well, I'll tell you, it's a real conundrum, and I've asked myself that question many times. So, as I look at the history I've studied, as I mentioned, civilization began in a very tiny pocket 6,000 years ago, roughly. It said it started in the Middle East, in Samaria. And I estimated that at that time, the population of people who kind of began this phenomenon of civilization were just a fraction of 1%, just a tiny, minuscule percentage or proportion of the population. And I started to chart sort of like the displacement of indigenous people by non-indigenous people, by so-called civilized people through the ages. And I believe, if I'm not correct, that, here, I'll just take a look. Actually, I'll just look up the figures that I found in my book here. So what I found is that by 1492, which is when Columbus so-called supposedly discovered America, there were only 60 million out of 550 million people who could be called so-called civilized. You know, these are people who follow the very human-centered perspective or perception of the world, and it primarily is identified with the Abrahamic religions, the Abrahamic traditions. And I basically found out, or I calculated that the number of non-Indigenous people did not exceed the number of Indigenous people until the 1820s. And so the population at that time was approximately 1.6 billion people. And my estimate of Indigenous people was that they were roughly still, they had, you know, like they were 800 million people, but the number of so-called civilized people had mushroomed to like an equivalent number. So, you know, if you take a look, for example, at the Greeks, the Romans, and, you know, like how they created their empires, and then of course the Spanish and the French, and coming over to North America and basically, you know, displacing Indigenous people here, largely through disease, but also through, you know, like their weaponry and technologies. But that whole thing really didn't explode until about the 1820s. And the reason why it exploded in the 1820s is it was a convergence of a number of things. One was the so-called Enlightenment, Age of Reason. Another one was the Industrial Age, beginning of industrialization. Another one was explosion of transportation systems all over the world. Of course, development of military technologies, colonialism. You know, this type of ideology, you know, these political and economic systems and human systems based on this approach to living in the world, you know, basically had reached the point at which they became so powerful and so omnipresent that, you know, they began to become the majority of the world's population. And of course, you can see what's happened in the last 200 years. And I conclude that today there's only about 5% of the world's population that's indigenous. However, I have to qualify that. You see, that 5% is the definition that's given by the United Nations. And so that definition applies to basically small minorities who still like what's called a very traditional lifestyle, very connected yet to the land, right? Not really industrialized or anything like that. But, you know, in all fairness, many of the groups that I might have otherwise called indigenous today have been sorted out of that definition. For example, I would argue that many of the cultures of, like many of the old cultures of the East, for example, Chinese, India, and that type of thing, I would not place them totally in the category of the Abrahamic traditions, for example. No, I think those cultures, those nations have been kind of forced to sort of replicate and duplicate the model of civilization, which has kind of been thrust on them as a matter of their own survival. But other than that, I don't think that they're not the hardcore, you know, advocates of civilization, the way, for example, the, you know, like the peoples of the Abrahamic traditions. And of course, I'm talking here about Christianity and Islam primarily. You know, when you take a look at what are now the two largest religions of the world, you know, they didn't become the largest religions of the world by accident.
Yeah, but maybe just because I live in Canada, and Canada has one of maybe few countries that I feel that's maybe it's not very right word, but indigenous renaissance. I feel that even, you know, that last, I've been in Canada for 20 years, and even for the last 10 years, I see that difference. The things changed,
Mm-hmm.
and um, not always in probably in right way. So, but it's something is going on, and I think it's in total, it's the vector is a positive. And after the final report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, it was released and it was accepted. It was kind of like probably official recognition of that, existing the problem, and that we have to look for some solutions and etc. And after that, what I noticed that many universities, they started kind of like process of uh, indigenization of education. But sometimes it looks to me, maybe I'm wrong, it's kind of like marketing tactics for some universities. And I'm kind of like, it looks very funny when they, again, I'm not racist or not anything like that, but when 10 non-Indigenous people who have never visited any First Nation community, who never met any Indigenous person, are kind of developing something Indigenous programs. What is this? Is this? Do you think it's possible to indigenize the existing education system, or it's better to build something new?
Well, you know, when I was young, I grew up and during the period of assimilation, right? I went to residential school. So I know, you know, what this whole process of, you know, attempting to, you know, whatever you want to call it, eradicate Indigenous culture and spirituality or brainwash people. I know what that's all about. And myself and many other survivors of residential school, you know, we had to go through quite a process to rediscover, to kind of figure out what was going on. And so, um, you know, there's certainly, you know, it can certainly be said that there's been progress, right? Like there's recognition, for example, of Indigenous lands, Indigenous rights, education, things like that. But, you know, it's interesting that those, for example, the rejection of the assimilation policy, that was basically forced through by the courts because the court said, look, you know, there was something here before Canada, right? The British were here before Canada and they signed a treaty. And so, you know, you have to live up to this treaty. Now, when Canada was formed, Sir Johnny Macdonald, he wanted to throw that whole thing out of the window and say, oh, you know, like just assimilate them, right? They're backwards, you know, like they're useless, right? We need to assimilate them so that they can become materialists and capitalists and all that kind of stuff, exploiters of nature and stuff, just like we are, basically, right? And so, you know, you have all of these things little by little. There have been more rights accorded to Indigenous people, you know, more rights to control our own affairs. You know, we've been given access, right, to mainstream institutions, you know, to get employment and create jobs and economic systems and that type of thing. But you'll notice in my book, Loss of Indigenous Eden, I talked about universities. And my term for them was they were universities of civilization. Because essentially what's being taught in universities is that ideology of human-centeredness, right? Civilization. Everybody's still glorifying the Greeks and Romans and, you know, all those things. They still don't really understand Indigenous people. And so, you know, like when a lot of people talk about Indigenous culture, Indigenous wisdom, they're talking about, oh, they had these knowledge of plants, right? There's knowledge of medicinal plants and, you know, like the sensitivity towards the environment, but they don't really get the real foundations of it, the real fundamentals, which is the spiritual nature of our belief system, right? That we actually believed that spirit is real, that the spiritual world is real, and that we had a mandate here as humans, right, to follow that spiritual mandate. So I mean, really, what they're doing is they're, like you say, it's like window dressing, right? It's like this is the latest, it's kind of like the latest fad, right? And we'll kind of add it to the mix and see what happens. But fundamentally, like I say, the teachings at university are, at its heart, are still civilizational. I mean, they're still teaching exploitation of the environment. They're still teaching cranking up of economic systems, right? They're still promoting the same kinds of systems of societal control, justice systems and all that kind of stuff, which which are these are all characteristics of civilization, which, as I mentioned in my book and I point out, they are fundamentally different in nature from an indigenous worldview, an indigenous way of practicing living in the physical world. And so, it's something which, I mean, universities like to do that, right? They like to take this kind of like it's a new fad, right? But I say that fundamentally, if they have to truly understand indigenous philosophy, they have to totally get out of the box. They have to totally get out of the box of civilization in order to see it. And one of the things I've said is one of the great fallacies of academia is that when they started to analyze the entire spectrum of human history, they started from the starting point of civilization 6,000 years ago. That's their starting point for analyzing the entire scope of human experience. And that's a mistake. That's a great mistake, because they should have started with the thinking that was there before that, which was indigenous thinking.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember kind of like story. My father, he was a constructor. He was a professional painter, carpenter, and he was doing all those things himself. And before his marriage, my grandmother, she built a 2-bedroom little house. I was born in that house. But then every time when I get the new brother and my son, my father, he built kind of a new bedroom, added. And at the end, he realized that I was adult at that time. He realized that it doesn't work. It's better to destroy and to build a new house. When you add a little bit, it doesn't work. It's not, as you said, it's not harmony. It's kind of something. Yeah, I totally agree. And to be honest, I mean, it's not kind of like I'm arguing, but my feeling is that it's. You mentioned that about like thousands or 6,000, but mostly even this academic history, it started about 200, 300 years ago. Even not even before that. It's
there you go.
Very materialistic, and I don't want to argue. Myself, I'm a religious person, but I don't want to say it's kind of like a very personal thing. But at least you have to teach both, right? So no matter what we do, what we teach, everything is about this materialism. So and yeah, you can say that, okay, yeah, this is a Newton's law, whatever. As the indigenous people say a little bit this way. I don't think it should be equally, at least. Leave choice to people, right?
That's right. Yeah, teach both perspectives and let people choose.
Yeah,
right?
yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah, but in terms of this, like this whole process of thinking, like we have a certain perception of thinking. It's called rationalism, the use of reason, right? The human mind, and it really is the foundation of knowledge systems today. They say, we can figure it out. We use our brains, we can figure it out, and at the same time, there tends to be a sort of a denigration of indigenous culture, which says they don't use their brains, they don't use their reasoning, they don't use their intelligence, which is totally false. It's totally false. If you take a look at what we talk about as the 4 quadrants of being, we talk about the physical, the emotional, intellectual. See, intellectual is there, right? But then we talk about the spiritual as well. The thing is that, so we made accomplishments in things like agriculture, astronomy, mathematics, all of these things. So obviously we were able to use our intellect. We observed, right? We came to conclusions. However, the thing that I would point out is that we did not think that the human mind was the end all and be all. For example, European philosophers like Descartes say, "I think, therefore I am," right? And it's very clear what the philosophers of the Enlightenment said. They said, all you need is your mind, right? We would change that. We would say you need a lot more than your mind. You need your spiritual understanding. You need your spirituality. And in my book, basically what I said is I said that spirituality is a higher form of intelligence. And I said that, what Indigenous people did is whenever we embarked on anything, whenever we were faced with any sort of problem, or whenever we felt we had to do something, the first thing we did is we prayed. The first thing we did was we consulted for spiritual wisdom and spiritual insight. And it's kind of a thing which people don't understand because it's not an intellectual process. It's a different kind of process. It's a process of humbling oneself as a human being and basically begging for insight, inspiration, whatever you want to call it. And a lot of people don't think this occurs. But I have no problem with that. I've experienced that type of thing myself in terms of like my own experiences. And but to kind of give it sort of a more of a context that people can understand, basically, if you're asking for spiritual wisdom, you're asking for the wisest direction that people could possibly take. Let's say, considering how everything would impact, let's say, your relatives. And here I'm not just talking about the 7 generations. I'm talking about the plants and the animals. And I would also say that, for example, in our way of understanding things, we understood about cycles. Even humans have cycles. We believe in rebirth, reincarnation. And so, all of these things gave us pause to think about what we're doing whenever we started to do things. And so, one way of understanding this is, I would say, if people in universities, well, I give the example of chemistry as one example. I say if we had indigenous chemistry, would we be producing chemicals that kill people and destroy the environment, kill plants, kill animals? Would we be creating chemicals that harm ourselves, right? That are produced primarily for money? In other areas, would we be building atomic bombs, or would we be building all of these other kinds of things which are really harmful technologies? And so, one of the first things we would ask is, why are we doing this? Why are we doing this? Is this really something we need to survive? And you see, the problem is that when you start looking at civilization, from a civilizational point of view, the motives have not been the motives. The motives have been, how can we gain more power? How can we gain more money? How can we get the upper hand on these next guys next door who don't agree with us, or they don't want to give us what they have that we want, right? That's civilizational thinking. It's based on money and power and human interest. And so, that's why, I've kind of said that intellect without spiritual guidance is like a mad dog running around. And that's basically the world we're living in. You simply have to look at some of our current world leaders, right?
Yeah, so not only current. Yeah, Yeah, and it's kind of like, yeah, as I said, I'm very, at least within my childhood, I was very connected to the village people, right? They are uh, very close to indigenous, that's culture and etc. That's the, um, they don't have that consumerism, you know. Uh, if you have enough for your living, why would you have more? Why would you take more? I think it's
Well, you would
kind of
because
like,
you, the only reason you would is because you got greedy.
yeah, and it's kind of like when you start taking something extra, then it becomes never enough. So I can grab more, and if I don't have enough for myself, I will grab from my neighbor. So it's kind of like,
Yeah, and
uh,
it produces counter reactions, right?
yeah,
You take
exactly,
this from them,
exactly.
and they're going to take it from you, and it's a cycle, right?
Exactly.
Yeah,
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 exactly. Exactly.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. One of these kind of, maybe it's a linguistic kind of problem, but we have these type of discussions with my colleagues, and I see that in academic society. Um, I tried with my colleagues, with my Cree speaker academics colleagues, we developed the Cree dictionary of mathematical words.
Mhm.
And I try to find the equivalent words in Cree for some mathematical terms. Then this, again, I don't want to name, but in some universities, I've heard that they started developing uh, indigenous science program. And I was curious how to translate science, how to say science in Cree, for example. But before that, I thought uh, about other languages, because I speak several languages. And in those languages, like Russian, Turkish, in my native language, other in Arabic, this they don't have a specifically the science as we use in English. We use the word knowledge, but the word science actually it's a composition of words, like uh, knowledge about precise things or precise knowledge. There is no specifically kind of like the word science. And I noticed that it's at least some, you know, those people that I asked Cree speaking, like Solomon Red, I asked him. Yeah, they told me that we can compose the phrase, which would be translated as science, but in English. But apparently, again, all those languages, they don't have specifically science. So as a Cree speaker, and definitely the English and Cree both are kind of like you learn both languages almost at the same time, right? You know both equally. Um, why it happens? Why do you think in English the science that we use in English? It's kind of like almost the equivalent of materialism. When we ask the so-called Western scientists, when you say science, they mean the materialism. They all mean that. But let's say in Turkish or in Arabic, in my language, science doesn't mean the specifically materialism. It's more than that. How about in Cree? What composition could be used to describe the science? Maybe that is a point why we have so much difference between Western and Indigenous.
Well, my Cree, for myself, I'm not really that fluent in Cree. I depend on the elders, to kind of give me knowledge about specific terms and their meanings and that type of thing. Ironically, my French is better than my Cree because I grew up in residential school and I used to hear the priests and nuns speaking French. But the thing I would say is that all of these terms basically had spiritual contexts. Like even mathematics, from what I understand, I don't remember the exact description, but like when they talked about numbers, they actually had spiritual meanings, like like about why you had 1 and 2 and and so on and so forth. Like there was, a spiritual sort of explanations woven into, like the so-called science of numbers. And I would think that in terms of science itself, really what it was about relationships. It was about relationships with plants, relationships with animals. That was their science. And they treated these plants and animals like they were spirits. They had they had consciousness in their own right. You could communicate with them through ceremonies, and that's how you developed a relationship. And indigenous people had great relationships with plants, right? They were excellent cultivators. They were very successful because of that approach. So that's sort of what I would say about that. So like the whole problem with the way that civilization has developed is, as time has gone on, all of these spiritual meanings have kind of been sifted out of these conversations. I mean, you can't walk into a meeting of scientists and start talking about spirituality or religion, can you? I mean, they'll think you're off your rocker, right? That's part of the problem.
Yeah, it's I mean, as I said you at the beginning before we started recording, I see the interest in academic society to indigenous, to understanding. Many people really want to understand indigenous, what indigenous means, and I know our time is limited, but at the end I have to ask this question. Recently, I was talking, I had informal discussions with Dr. Ijaz Ahmed. He's a Dean of Science and Mathematics at Brock University. And we talked about the COVID, and he said, we have to learn from indigenous people how to survive. So, really, I've noticed that even not in academic society, one of this kind of synonymous of indigenous means survival, because indigenous people survived many climate changes, many things. I don't want to mention all of them. So, what's your survival plan for this COVID?
Oh, well, I'm doing my best. But maybe I can come back to your question. You asked me that question, are we all going to survive this?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And so one of the ways I would answer that is, and actually I'm starting another book, which is going to be carrying on from The Knowledge Seeker and Loss of Indigenous Eden. And it kind of sort of addresses that question. And one of the things I would say, like I talked about how non-Indigenous people only became the majority of world population over the last 200 years. And you yourself pointed out that a lot of the so-called rationalistic thinking, it's only been around for a couple hundred years. So what about all that way of life, way of thinking, way of living that carried us so successfully for all those hundreds of thousands of years before? What about it, right? Nobody seems to know any, you all seem to have forgotten about it. So what I say is that there has to be some genetic memory within all of us, because all of us were originally indigenous. The whole ideology of the world prior to civilization was indigenous, see? And so, basically what I'm saying is, number one, we have to realize the pitfalls of civilization. And like I said before, academics should have started to analyze the human experience from the beginning of indigenous knowledge, not from the starting point of civilization. That was a big mistake. If they would have started from the starting point of indigenous knowledge, they would have seen that civilization was not the best choice. So what I'm saying is that, if we are to survive, and I'm basically saying that civilization is self-destructive, because it's about humans thinking that they're the only ones that matter, and in the process they're destroying everything else. So we have to get out of this civilizational mode of doing things. We have to rediscover our indigenous ways of knowing. And so we have to realize that, Indigenous knowledge and ways of being are not stupid. It's civilization that's stupid in the way it's going about things. And the thing is, how do we get people to realize that? Because people are so swept up in this whole civilization thing. They think that civilization is the best thing that's ever been done, because look at what it's done for us as people. It's a very elusive, it's a very, sort of a seductive thing that's kind of, some people talk about it as a psychosis. It's like a psychosis that's kind of overtaken us. And so we need to rediscover our indigeneity. We need to reconnect with our Indigenous roots, and non-Indigenous people need to be allies of Indigenous people like yourself, for example, who are learning about it, right? You can say, Indigenous knowledge is important, and this is why it's important. And it's meaningful. It's actually crucial. It's actually crucial for, like the direction that we're heading in, because, our elders have been saying for some time, the direction we're going is not good. Something very terrible is going to happen if things don't change. We have what's called the 7 generations prophecy. And it says, it kind of prophesied that people would come here and they would not understand, and they would go in the wrong, bad path, but that Indigenous people would, teach them the right path. But if they didn't learn the right path, then all of humanity would be doomed to failure. So that's, so I can't answer your question whether or not we're going to get out of this or not. It depends on a lot of things.
Definitely, that's a rhetorical question, but thank you for providing that explanation. Thank you very much again for your time. I really enjoyed our discussions, and I hope we will continue. As I said, I asked me maybe 1/3 of the questions that I prepared. Thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to reading your new book.
Good. Okay.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you for interviewing me.
Thank you very much.
Okay.